I spent a considerable amount of time tonight reviewing the latest data points entering the public ledger, and it is very clear that we are navigating a highly unique inflection point in our economic history. The headlines are completely dominated by intense debate surrounding the confirmation of a new Federal Reserve chair, alongside some remarkably warm inflation metrics that have caught many standard commentators completely off guard. We just saw the Consumer Price Index register a significant year-over-year acceleration, while the Producer Price Index experienced a massive 1.4% expansion in a single monthly window. When you observe wholesale production costs climbing at their fastest monthly trajectory in years, it is entirely natural for the average individual to experience a sudden wave of psychological pressure regarding their financial future. The general public is currently being bombarded with frantic predictions about deepening supply chain disruptions, energy sector volatility, and the potential for a prolonged contraction in working-class purchasing power. But if I am being completely transparent with you tonight, allowing these external macroeconomic shocks to dictate your immediate emotional state is the primary behavioral trap that destroys long-term capital accumulation. I remember a distinct phase during my early 20s when I allowed every single policy shift, geopolitical conflict, or central banking announcement to completely disrupt my internal clarity and my strategy. I was working my first corporate position after completing my undergraduate degree in entrepreneurship, meticulously tracking every single dollar of my modest earnings and feeling an immense sense of urgency as the structural cost of survival climbed. I foolishly believed that the only way to insulate my life from systemic risk was to actively monitor the news, attempt to predict the precise movement of interest rates, and trade highly volatile individual equities. That experimental phase did not result in a sudden wealth breakthrough. It actually resulted in a brutal psychological correction that forced me to realize that chasing short-term macroeconomic trends is a mathematical path to portfolio ruin. Losing that early momentum was an incredibly painful experience, but it was also the exact moment I chose to stop focusing on variables I cannot control and start anchoring my entire existence to unyielding mathematical laws. Tonight, I want to step completely away from the sensationalized media narratives and explain why these chaotic institutional shifts actually reinforce the absolute necessity of a boring, rules-based defensive framework. To accurately decode the current environment without succumbing to the general panic of the marketplace, we must view everything through the precise lens of a structural condition known as fiscal dominance. Fiscal dominance establishes itself when a sovereign nation's total underlying debt and ongoing deficit trajectory become so massive that they effectively neutralize the traditional mechanisms of monetary policy. In a conventional textbook economy, the Federal Reserve can simply adjust its short-term benchmark interest rates to cool down an overheating system or stimulate credit expansion during a standard cyclical slowdown. But under a mature state of fiscal dominance, that primary lever loses its structural transmission capability because the sheer volume of government bond issuance creates its own independent gravitational pull within the global capital markets. When international market participants begin demanding an elevated risk premium to absorb continuous debt issuance, long-term yields like mortgages and auto loans climb regardless of what the central bank decides to do with its overnight rate. The popular idea that any single central banker can step into office, execute a few policy modifications, and single-handedly reverse the momentum of global supply chain shocks is a complete structural illusion. When you look at the raw historical data surrounding retail investors who attempt to constantly adjust their asset allocation based on changing geopolitical headlines or policy predictions, the survival rate is staggeringly low. Studies consistently reveal that over a multi-year time horizon, more than 90% of active traders fail to outperform a simple low-cost index fund that quietly captures the aggregate return of the broader market. This means that even during periods of historic macroeconomic volatility, the structural friction of emotional execution, tax liabilities, and transaction costs will systematically destroy your wealth faster than inflation itself. Accepting the reality that you cannot influence global supply chains or predict central banking behavior is not an admission of defeat. It is actually the ultimate prerequisite for establishing your personal financial superpower. Let us calculate the true mathematical cost of trying to outsmart an unpredictable global economy versus completely automating your defensive framework. Imagine you allocate 15 hours every single week to analyzing international trade balances, tracking executive policy shifts, and attempting to time the exact bottom of a specific commodity sector. If you possess a starting portfolio of $dollars, and your intense cognitive labor somehow manages to generate an extra 5% return above the market baseline, you have produced an additional $500 of gross capital appreciation. When you divide that $500 gain by the hundreds of hours of intense mental friction and administrative stress you endured throughout the year, your effective hourly wage for that active management equals less than $1. Furthermore, because those frequent transactions occur within a standard taxable brokerage ledger, short-term capital gains tax schedules will immediately step in to claim a massive percentage of that hard-earned return. Now, let us contrast that exhausting process with the reality of an individual who completely surrenders the desire to be clever, accepts the aggregate market return, and automates their entire financial existence. That individual establishes a consistent bi-weekly dollar-cost averaging pipeline that automatically redirects a fixed percentage of their professional corporate paycheck into a total market index fund, like VU or VTI. They do not care about the changing political composition of the Federal Reserve Board. They do not check the daily consumer price index releases, and they never spend a single second wondering whether equity prices are at a cyclical peak. Because their investment allocation remains entirely passive, their internal asset turnover remains at absolute zero, meaning they never trigger unnecessary transaction frictions or tax events that erode long-term performance. By choosing the boring path of maximum diversification, they are quietly harnessing the collective productivity, pricing power, and long-term innovation of the entire global economic engine. The ultimate irony of wealth accumulation in your 20s is that the individuals who try the hardest to maximize their short-term returns almost always finish behind the individuals who focus entirely on maximizing their personal savings rate. When your total portfolio baseline is under $9, your ability to control your lifestyle overhead, minimize your fixed expenses, and expand your primary professional income is infinitely more powerful than your specific asset returns. I managed to secure my first dollars by age 26. Not because I discovered a magical equity shortcut or accurately predicted an inflation cycle, but because I embraced the deep discipline of absolute lifestyle consistency. I drove an older vehicle that was completely paid off, maintained a highly structured household budget, and treated every single salary increase at my corporate position as an opportunity to expand my automated investment volume. There is a massive structural trap within modern society that encourages young professionals to instantly expand their standard of living the exact moment their professional earnings begin to mature. We see our peers financing premium vehicles, moving into luxury apartments, and utilizing consumer debt to project an illusion of affluent success, long before they have built a real self-sustaining asset base. When you choose to step completely away from that cycle of competitive consumption, you instantly insulate yourself from the systemic vulnerabilities that quietly destroy the financial security of the middle class. The modern political and financial architecture is engineered to encourage maximum consumption and continuous debt utilization, which means staying disciplined is a profound act of personal sovereignty. Every single application on your mobile device is actively optimized to capture your attention and convert your internal restlessness into corporate revenue, whether through lifestyle spending or speculative financial trading. When you cultivate the internal clarity to say that you do not require immediate luxury or public validation, you free up the physical capital necessary to purchase your long-term independence. The path to your first dollars is universally recognized as a brutal, slow, and visually unrewarding climb because your underlying principle is simply too small to generate noticeable compounding momentum on its own ledger. If you have $10 invested and the broader market delivers a standard 8% annual return, the resulting $400 of passive growth feels completely inconsequential relative to your lifetime goals. Because the immediate feedback loop is so quiet, the vast majority of young investors abandon their discipline within the first 24 months of their wealth-building journey. They decide that the process is far too slow, conclude that the traditional system is entirely broken, and pivot their attention back to high-risk trading or immediate lifestyle inflation. But if you possess the psychological fortitude to survive that initial linear phase and push past the six-figure boundary, the core mathematics of your balance sheet undergo a fundamental structural shift. A $9 portfolio tracking a standard broad market index fund will generate approximately $10 of passive capital appreciation during a normal economic cycle without a single second of physical labor. At that exact inflection point, your accumulated capital is officially contributing more momentum to your wealth creation goals than many individuals can afford to save from their active employment. The boulder has finally crossed the absolute peak of the hill, and it begins gathering its own natural gravitational velocity while you simply stand back and monitor its trajectory. To build that initial six-figure foundation without succumbing to the volatile noise of the world, you must construct a defensive system that completely neutralizes your own human emotions. I structured my finances so that my long-term wealth-building execution is entirely decoupled from my daily psychological state or my views on current events. The exact hour my corporate direct deposit hits my checking account, my system automatically routes my defined savings target into my investment accounts before I ever have the chance to perceive that cash as disposable income. If you allow yourself to make a conscious choice every single month about whether you feel comfortable investing your remaining balance, your brain will consistently manufacture a highly logical justification to spend it. We are naturally adaptive creatures who instinctively expand our operational expenses to match whatever liquidity is visible within our immediate transactional accounts. By keeping my investment capital completely invisible from my daily life, I force myself to build an existence around a structurally lower baseline of consumption without ever experiencing a sense of artificial deprivation. I am entirely comfortable with the reality that my portfolio allocation is completely unoriginal, boring, and utterly lacking in speculative excitement. I do not possess a private informational pipeline into central banking committees. I do not have access to high-frequency institutional trading terminals, and I cannot predict the next quarterly inflation surprise. But by holding a highly diversified basket of total market index funds, I am guaranteed to capture the exact aggregate return of human productivity without ever risking a permanent loss of capital to a single corporate failure. The real challenge of this multi-decade wealth-building journey is never understanding the baseline textbook mechanics of finance, because the math is simple enough for a child to comprehend. Shouts out the real structural friction is managing your own internal psychology when the broader macroeconomic landscape enters a period of severe geopolitical instability, policy transitions, or market liquidations. The immediate primal instinct of the human brain during an economic contraction or an inflation spike is to seek immediate safety, liquidate assets, and pause contributions to prevent theoretical downside. But to survive as a long-term capital allocator, you must train yourself to understand that a secular market correction is a perfectly normal mandatory feature of the wealth-building process rather than a functional design flaw. If you are an investor who is actively building their asset base in their 20s, a severe market decline is actually the greatest structural gift the economy can possibly present to your timeline. It allows your automated bi-weekly contributions to acquire institutional shares at a massive permanent discount, significantly accelerating the total number of units you accumulate before the next cyclical expansion. When the prices of everyday household goods or consumer electronics experience a massive reduction, we perceive it as an exceptional purchasing window and eagerly participate in the marketplace. Yet, when the ownership shares of the greatest wealth-producing corporations on Earth experience a temporary clearance sale, the general public frequently panics and abandons the market entirely. To navigate those highly emotional cycles without making a catastrophic behavioral error that sets your timeline back by years, you must maintain a rock-solid foundation of short-term liquidity. I maintain a completely separate, untouchable cash reserve that holds a full 6 months of essential living expenses parked inside a high-yield savings vehicle that remains entirely decoupled from my equity portfolio. This emergency buffer does not exist to maximize my financial efficiency or compete with market returns. It exists exclusively to preserve my psychological stability and ensure I am never forced to sell equities during a market downturn. If my primary source of professional revenue experiences a sudden structural interruption due to a broader corporate workforce shift, I know I can comfortably survive for half a year without ever looking at my portfolio. That absolute peace of mind allows me to view global market volatility with complete emotional detachment, knowing that my long-term compounding engine is entirely insulated from immediate operational pressures. We also need to have a very frank, unvarnished conversation about the critical role that early career progression plays in crossing that first $1,000,000 milestone. You can practice the most aggressive budgeting techniques in the world, but if your baseline income is structurally capped near the baseline of survival, your wealth accumulation speed will hit a hard mathematical ceiling. I realized very early in my professional journey that while minimizing discretionary overhead was essential for developing financial discipline, expanding my active earning capacity was the true operational catalyst. I focused my energy on developing highly specialized technical skills, volunteering to lead complex cross-functional projects at my employer, and positioning myself strategically for regular internal promotions. Every single time my corporate compensation experienced a meaningful structural increase, I immediately directed 80% of that fresh capital straight into my automated investment pipeline. This specific defensive strategy completely prevented the silent creeping poison of lifestyle inflation, allowing my net worth curve to bend upward dramatically while my daily standard of living remained comfortable and stable. It is incredibly easy to look at the shifting landscape of central banks, the institutional policy games, or the overnight windfalls of speculative traders and conclude that quiet personal discipline is a pointless pursuit. But the reality that the internet will never tell you is that wealth built on a foundation of leverage, luck, and trying to outrun macro cycles is inherently fragile and completely decoupled from internal character. True financial independence is not merely about the final absolute number displayed on a digital balance sheet. It is about the structural habits, internal discipline, and emotional maturity you cultivate during the process of building that number. When you cross that first $1 boundary through pure self-reliance, emotional restraint, and consistent mathematical execution, you have built a psychological fortress that can never be taken away from you. You wake up one morning, review your automated tracking spreadsheets, and realize that you have quietly established a six-figure foundation that completely alters your systemic leverage within the modern economy. Accumulating dollars in your 20s does not mean you have achieved permanent retirement, or that you can completely abandon your professional obligations, but it completely rewrites the rules of your existence. It means you possess the structural capacity to comfortably walk away from a toxic employment environment or an unethical professional situation without the fear of immediate financial ruin.